This is an open question and answer period. We may, after Shuas, maybe switch a format, but as I always say every week, you can ask me absolutely anything. I don't promise I can answer anything, that's for sure not. But there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Whatever you want to talk about is perfectly fine. So I throw the floor open. So let me talk a little bit about this generally. You know, the Parsha that we're reading this week is actually the longest Parsha in the Torah. It has many, many different things in it. But part of why it's so long is that the last part of the Parsha talks about the sacrifices that were brought on the days that the Mishkan was dedicated. The Mishkan was dedicated on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and starting for that first day, for the next 12 days, the heads of each tribe brought a sacrifice, or brought a bunch of sacrifices in honor of the dedication of the tabernacle. That is called Chanukas HaMishkan, Chanukah, the dedication of the Mishkan. Now the problem is, the 12 tribes each brought an identical offering, a whole bunch of things. So the Torah normally doesn't waste words. The Torah could have told me what the first Nasi brought, and then it could have just said, and everybody else brought the same thing. And yet the Torah repeats A to Z 12 times. He brought A to Z, he brought A to Z, he brought A to Z, he brought A to Z. So if you're a Baal Koreh, it actually is an easy Parsha because the trup is the same. The notes, the musical notes are the same 12 times. So it's a big Parsha, but there's a tremendous amount of repetition. And what is the significance of that repetition? So I'm going to give you two answers to that. And they move in opposite directions, but both answers are true. Answer number one is that even though externally the 12 tribes did the same thing, internally it was 12 different things. The symbolism, each tribe had separate intentions for each thing they brought. The Medrash spells this out. This is very important, meaning what Yehuda meant when he brought a silver bowl was not what Zevulun meant. And this is an important lesson because it teaches us that even when all of us are doing the same mitzvahs, we bring our own individuality to them. Each of us develops our own relationship with Hashem, our own intentions, our own meanings, our own understandings. Community does not mean conformity. It does not mean sameness. It does not mean everybody is identical in how they view things. Each one of us has to foster an individual relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is highlighted by the fact that even if all of us are putting on tefillin and all of us keep Shabbos and all of us keep kashrus, but what you have in mind when you put on tefillin is not what I have in mind. Each one of us are individuals. So answer number one of why the korban is repeated 12 times, even though it is the same offering, is that externally it was the same, internally it was not. And that's an important lesson for us, that we have to serve God as individuals, even though we are functioning as part of a community. That's answer number one. Answer number two is, the Torah is teaching you a very important lesson here. And the real hero is really the second Nasi. Nachshon ben Aminadav was the Nasi of the tribe of Yehuda who brought the first korban. Nachshon was a well-known hero already. He was a hero. Remember, Nachshon ben Aminadav was the person who jumped into the Red Sea up to his neck when the water didn't split yet. And the Jewish people see the Egyptians coming after them, and they're panicked. They don't know what to do. And they're between literally a rock and a hard place, the Egyptian army and the sea. And some people said, let's commit suicide. Some says, let's try to fight. Some say, let's run back to Mitzrayim. Some say, let us appeal to the United Nations to help us, etc. Obviously, they were the most foolish group, and the like. Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped into the sea up to his neck or up to his nose because he had absolute faith in Hashem's words, and the sea split. So Nachshon ben Aminadav is already a hero, and he is the one who brings all these korbanos on day one. Now, the Nasi of day two is the Nasi of the tribe of Yisachar. Now, the Nasi of day two had a decision to make, because keeping up with the Joneses or keeping up with the Katzes would indicate, oh, if Nachshon brought a korban, I'll make it better. And he would have determined that this would be a competition. Instead, he decided to bring exactly the same offering. What is the precedent he's establishing? We're not in competition. We're working together. And therefore the Torah spells out the fact in great arichos that they all brought the same to highlight that because the Nisim were doing this l'shem shamayim, they were doing this for the sake of heaven. They were not doing this for self-aggrandizement. There was no inyan of trying to do better than the other. Right? That's the idea of the repetition. It's very similar to the idea that a person who truly serves Hashem doesn't really care if he does the mitzvah or somebody else does the mitzvah, as long as the mitzvah is done. Right? The Chazon Ish used to say, consider this thought experiment. Let's imagine that you're a very hospitable person who loves having guests for Shabbos. And one Friday night, there's no guest you can invite. Everybody was taken. And you finally see a guest, and you rush over to the guest and say, please, please, can I have you for Shabbos? And the guest tells you, well, thank you very much, but I was just invited by so-and-so. So the Chazon Ish says, what's your reaction? Do you feel bad, or do you feel good? So this is what he says. Now this is a tough thought experiment. If the reason why you like to have guests is because you want to do chesed to them, you want to take care of them, you want them to be taken care of, then you should be just as happy if he's somewhere else. Because Baruch Hashem, you're taken care of, assuming it's just as good a family. If, on the other hand, you like to do chesed because it feeds your ego and it gives you pride, then you're going to feel bad because why is he doing it, not me? And when you really serve Hashem l'shem shamayim, it's not an egotistical thing. So you're just very, very happy that the person is being served. And that's what the Nisim showed. The Nisim showed this is not a competition. We are doing it to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All of you have heard of the Panovich Yeshiva, Bnei Brak. It's not the world's largest yeshiva. Mir is larger, maybe Lakewood, but Panovich is one of the great yeshivas in the world. Panovich was a city in Lithuania, and the founder of the yeshiva here was the last Rav of Panovich before the Holocaust, Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman. And Rav Kahaneman was an amazing person, not only a Gadol B'Torah, but a person who everybody loved, everybody who met him, whether you were a simple Jew, an uneducated Jew, he just had a way of connecting to everybody he met. He was also a spellbinding orator and an indefatigable fundraiser. He would raise money for a million different things. In fact, the Satmar Rebbe once said, when people were discussing, is there life on other planets? He says, I know for sure there is no life on other planets, because if there would be, the Panovich Rav would be collecting money there. So if the Panovich Rav has not come to Mars, I know there's no life in Mars. That's enough of a proof for me. So the story goes, the Panovich Rav, who was an amazing fundraiser because people less loved him. I mean, he was funny and learned and deep and simple at the same time. So he once came to Chicago. He used to come to Chicago quite a lot, actually. And he came the same time as a fundraiser for a small yeshiva in Bnei Brak. Navardik came. So when the Navardik guy saw the Panovich Rav, he figured, there's no use in my even competing. I'm not even going to ask people for money because nobody's going to give me anything. I'm just going to listen to the Panovich Rav and enjoy it. So the Panovich Rav gave his Gewaldige Shir, profound, deep, funny stories, insights, commentary, the whole 9 yards as he would give it, only he could give it. And of course, people pulled out their checkbooks and they were going to write very, very generous checks because this was such a wonderful experience. And the Panovich Rav said at the end of his speech, Rabbosai, there's a gentleman sitting in the back who has a very, very fine yeshiva in Bnei Brak. And it's worthy of your support. So I would request that the money you're going to give me, give to him instead. Well, suffice it to say that this Navardik Meshulach got much more money than he ever got in any of his other trips because essentially he got what would go to the Panovich Rav. So he goes to the Panovich Rav afterwards and says, Rebbe, I'm so grateful, but I don't understand. You traveled all the way from from Eretz Yisrael to Chicago. And in those days, the trip took a lot longer than it took now. And you work so hard to raise money for your yeshivas. How could you just give it to somebody else? How could you give it to another yeshiva? The Panovich Rav said, I don't know what you mean, another yeshiva. We work for the same team. If I collect enough money to support 20 students for a year, I don't care, he said, if those 20 students are learning in Panovich or those 20 students are learning in Dvardik. The main point is God's Torah is being supported and enhanced. He says, I don't have a concept of my yeshiva, your yeshiva. Now, this is a very rare attitude even among great Rosh Yeshivas. So I might call it an extreme, but it really highlights the idea that the person that is the ultimate Eved Hashem doesn't have a proprietary thing that it has to be his institution, his yeshiva. The Iker is that the Torah of God be done. By the way, the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, who was nifter last year, of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, again, a very inspiring person from Chicago also. He was born in Chicago. And he had Parkinson's for more than 20 years, almost 30 years. And he still persevered. But he was that way as well. When he would come to the United States collecting money, and he would then visit Lakewood or Ner Yisrael, he would give money to Kollel people there. Oh, you take money, you're learning, And he had to have somebody watch him, like somebody from Mir who would stay with him to be sure that money collected for Mir will go to Mir. Because his idea was exactly the same attitude. He says, support of Torah is support of Torah. I don't care if it's here or there or somewhere else. So my long answer is, that's why the repetition. Now, why it says at the end, this is the korban of the Nasi, I think it's emphasizing the first point, that even though everybody brought the same, but there was a uniqueness to the korban in terms of their kavanos, in terms of their thoughts as they brought the korban. So I think it underscores individuality within conformity. That's very important. We all do the same mitzvahs, but all of us have to bring our own individuality to those mitzvahs. And to think about, what individual way do I serve Hashem? How do I glorify Hashem with my personality? That's an important thing. And again, to elaborate on that a little bit, just very much bekitzer, we live in Yerushalayim. We're fortunate to be in Yerushalayim, at least temporarily. Some of us are here permanently, Mirza Hashem. And you'll meet people that have a yichus of great rabbis that might go back, 20, 30 generations after generation. Talmidei Chachamim, greatness, Gedolim, Kedusha. Then we can look at ourselves, and maybe we don't have the yichus. Maybe we're like the first generation that became religious. Maybe we come from Montana or South Dakota, or a place where there was no real Yiddishkeit. And we could feel a little low and maybe a little despondent and saying, how can I ever catch up? How can I ever amount to something great? I'll always be second rate, third rate, fourth rate, 10th rate. Right? That feeling of rivalry and competition. But you have to understand that Hashem put our neshamas exactly where our neshamas needed to be. And if it's true that the 10th generation rabbinical family has something that we don't have, and that's true, it's also true that the person who comes from North Dakota and is the first generation to be religious in 100 years has something that the 10 generations of rabbis don't have either. Each person has an individual gift, which is what they give back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to kind of look at somebody else and say, oh, if only I had what they had, then I would be serving Hashem, is shortchanging the gifts of your own life that Hashem gave to you. Every person has something unique. The Baal Tshuva who comes from nowhere, so to speak, has something unique that the person who is an FFB doesn't have, just as the FFB has certain things that the Baal Tshuva doesn't have. But each person has to look at their lives and see the beauty and see the greatness. And there's no question that every one of us brings something unique to the panorama of Am Yisrael that otherwise would not be present. And that goes back to the idea that we're not in competition, but it's precisely our individuality that creates the beauty of the community. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but it's a good perspective, because unity is not about conformity. It's about taking the individuality and coming together for a common purpose and a common goal.
If you say bracha, but you want to say another bracha, I have to say this bracha because, for example, I say Baruch Atah Hashem. For example, in the morning it happened to me. I first of all you have to say Anatilat Yadayim, but I wanted to say Mitzvah Tzitzit. I have to. Can I also say Anatilat Yadayim?
In other words, you want to switch the bracha in the middle.
Yeah, but
in
I
other
haven't
words,
said it. I haven't said Baruch Atah Hashem, and then I have in my mind to say something, but I changed my mind and want to say something.
Yeah. So normally, that's a good question. Normally, when you say Hashem, whatever your thought was when you said God's name is how you should finish the bracha. Mm-hmm. So I would say it depends on whether it's a proper bracha then or not. Meaning like this. Let's say I picked up this coffee, and I'm supposed to make shahakol. But let's say I thought it was wine. So when I said Baruch Atah Hashem, I was going to say Borei Pri Hagafen. But then I say, oh no, it's coffee. So then, of course, I switch back to shahakol, because Borei Pri Hagafen would be an improper bracha. Yeah. So if the bracha you're going to say is a bracha that you're not supposed to say at that point, then you say it right. But if it's a bracha that you could say, like Al Natilas Yadayim, some people say before tzitzis, some people say after.
Okay, so
in other words, the question is, even if it's not your minhag, if it's a bracha that you would be able to say at this point, then you should say it based on what you thought of when you said Hashem's name. If it's a bracha you cannot say at this point, then you say it the right, you say Al Mitzvah Tzitzit, you correct
so
it.
It's okay to say Al Mitzvah Tzitzit, although it's better to say Al Natilat Yadayim.
First, that's correct. It is okay to say Al Mitzvah Tzitzit before Al Natilat Yadayim. Okay? Yes, that is okay. Yeah. So in your particular case, that's what I would do. But if it's a totally wrong bracha, then you would not. Then you would not. So, for example, even then, though, I'll tell you there are some interesting exceptions. I'll give you an exception. This is a Yotzi Min HaKlal. Let's say you're davening Shabbos davening. It's Friday night. And after you finish the first three brachas, Hakel HaKadosh, you're supposed to begin with this special paragraph about Shabbos, Atah Kidashta. But let's say, as sometimes happens, your mind is wandering, and when you say Atah Kidashta, instead of Atah Kidashta, you say Atah Chonein, which is actually the beginning of the weekday. Yeah. So the halacha is, if you begin a weekday bracha, even on Shabbos, you finish that bracha. Not all of Shemona. You then go back to the Shabbos davening, but the bracha that you began, you finish. But even though it's a weekday Shemona Esrei, even though it's a bracha from the weekday, but the reason is only for that bracha. In other words, you then go back to Shabbos. The reason being that according to the strict halacha, it would have been permitted to pray weekday davening even on Shabbos, but we don't because we don't want to make you sad thinking about all the things you need on Shabbos. But since Me'ikir Hadin, a weekday tefillah would be valid for Shabbos, so whatever bracha you started, you finish. But that's a Yotzei Min HaKlal, based on the idea that weekday brachas are technically acceptable on Shabbos. That has not been for Oneg Shabbos and Kircha taking up the extra time. Okay, but that's an exception. That doesn't deal with your particular question.
But if I started, but can it change? I don't have to say that Atah Chonein.
Yeah, no, you do. That's what I'm saying. That's an exception. If you started Atah Chonein,
but it's not a bracha.
Even though you didn't say Hashem's name, once you started Atah Chonein, once you said the word of the weekday bracha, you say only that one weekday bracha, and then you go back to the Shabbos blessing.
But you have to say Baruch Atah, the whole blessing.
Yeah, the whole blessing. Yeah, the whole blessing. Baruch Atah Hashem Chonein Hadas. Yeah.
It's better to than to stop. And
that's correct. That's correct. You say the whole blessing. Yeah. Unusual. Yeah.
Is it healthy or good to be competitive? Like, how far should you be?
Well, it's a tricky thing. Obviously, you're thinking of the well-known Gemara. The Gemara says, "Kinas sofrim tarbe chochma." Kinas sofrim means literally means the jealousy of Torah scholars increases wisdom, which seems to indicate that a certain amount of competition motivates you to be better and better, which would indicate there is such a thing as healthy competition. On the other hand, the Bali Musar explained that this is not really competition in the classical sense. If you want somebody to fail and not be so successful, so you'll do better, that's totally bad. It's totally bad to ever wish someone not to be matzliach. As Rav Hirsch says, if you're here and I'm here, and I want there to be an equilibrium, there are two ways I can make an equilibrium. One is by lowering you, and one is by raising myself. Now, gravity is an easier force to deal with, so often I'd like you to be down here with me. That's totally bad. That's called jealousy, and that is improper. But if it's a competition which is not being jealous of somebody, but just saying to yourself, if he could do it, then maybe I could try to do it. Then that could be a motivator, right? So you have to be very careful. I don't know if we would call that competition in a sense. But if you're simply looking at role models and simply saying, if he could do it, I could do it, that's a reasonable basis for motivation. But it should never be the notion, I want to be better than him. I think I want to be better than him is already jealousy, and that's a bad meter. So it depends how you're doing it. Yeah.
Hey, what about the cases, like specifically, like in like sports or something?
Oh, in sports, okay, the same thing.
Gonna lose and one team's
Yeah. So I've seen a discussion of that. I know my Rosh Hashiva of Weinberg. I didn't hear him say it, but I read that he said it. Had said that he thought that competition in sports was a bad thing. The notion that I want to win and the like. And in a way, it's hard to justify. On the other hand, if the idea is that I want to do my best, then it becomes healthy. Each team wants to do its best, and whether they win or lose, they don't get upset because they did their best. Then it becomes a healthy thing. So a sportsmanship that is simply based on the joy of doing your best is a healthy motivation. But it shouldn't be that I want to crush the other side, I want to beat the other side, I want to humiliate the other side. Then it becomes a very, very difficult thing. So, in fact, the Rosh Hashiva took the position that introducing competition on those levels will spill over into ruchnius and really have bad effects in other avodas. So he was not in favor of competition. Even grade competition in schools isn't so great, where you give prizes based on people who get the highest grades. Theoretically, we should award people based on effort. So even if somebody gets a 70, but they worked much harder, they deserve more reward. That's how Hashem does it, certainly. Hashem rewards people based on effort. But Lamaisa, how does a teacher really can't measure effort that much. So, it's hard to say. But competition generally is not a good thing. We live in a world in which I should be as happy with your success as I am happy with my own success. So how's their competition? I'm happy if you win, I'm happy if I win. I want to tell you something that it's interesting that although there are sources that say children don't have a Yetzer Tov until they're bar mitzvah, they're born with the Yetzer Hara, but I sometimes notice things in little children that seem to be very, very positive that adults grow out of, or we grow out of as adults. I remember when my son was in first grade. He came home and he was so excited that one of his friends won an award that Shabbos. They were giving out awards. And as an adult, I was thinking to myself, gee, why didn't he get it? Why didn't my son get an award? And yet, he was so happy. There was no jealousy. The fact that his friend got it was as joyous to him as if he himself got it. And I thought that was really a really great madrega, that he mamish was misameach in the simcha of his friend as if it was his simcha. And that's the way it is. I remember reading letters, and again, we can't judge people who are suffering, but I remember reading a letter many, many years ago. It was an anonymous letter written to the Jewish Observer, which was a magazine of, in fact, I don't know if you know Rabbi Nissen Walpin, who lives here in retirement with his children, but he was the editor of the Jewish Observer for many, many years. It was a very, very well-respected magazine in the religious world. And people would often write these anonymous letters. If they wanted to complain about something, they'd write a letter. So this was a letter written by a woman who was married for many years. And she and her husband were not blessed with children. And she basically wrote a letter complaining about the insensitivity of people who are always bringing their children to things. That she has to sit and people talk about their children. Don't they realize how painful it is to her that people are talking about their kids and their grandkids and showing pictures of their kids and the like, and bringing their kids to events, as if where the kid's supposed to be, okay. And she just felt that this was a stab in her heart, that every time people are talking about children. Now again, I don't want to judge this woman, and again, it of course is painful. But just talking about it theoretically, our attitude should be very, very, very different. If a person doesn't have the bracha of children, that's a very sad thing. But ideally, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to rejoice in the blessings that Hashem gave to others. That the fact that other people have children should be a cause of joy for me, not a cause of sadness and dismay. And in many ways, one should be misameach in the simchas that Hashem gave others. And the truth of the matter is, if Chazal say, if you pray for somebody else who needs something and you need the same thing, Hashem will answer you in the zechus of you praying for somebody else. Like Avraham. Avraham and Sarah didn't have children for many years. But when Sarah was taken by Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, and as a result of the punishment, Avimelech's, the orifices of the community were closed and they couldn't have children. And Avraham prayed for Avimelech, and right afterwards it says, Sarah conceived. And Rashi brings the Gemara that says, when you pray for somebody else and you need it, you're going to be answered. So by the same token, the joy you have in somebody else's simcha can be a segula that you'll get that simcha too. Right? So in a sense, letters like that bother me because although I do understand. And I'm not condemning any individual at all because I do understand the feeling. But ultimately, Hashem wants us to not have that jealousy and to have the simcha in the simchas of others. And that, I think, is a skula in many ways to be zoicha for your own bracha in life. Same thing with shidduchim. I read other open letters where people were saying, "Oh, I wish my roommate wouldn't talk about her chassan all the time because I'm not engaged." Okay, you live in a world where people get married, where people have children, and accept it. Not only accept it, rejoice with it, be happy. So that's my answer about competition. Yeah.
Just to repeat what you said the joy you have in someone else's simcha will help you rejoice in your own?
Yes. I think so, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to bestow blessings on those who rejoice in the blessings that are given to others. That's Tovas Ayin. That's called Tov Ayin. And Tov Ayin means a generous eye. And the pasuk says in Mishlei, Tov Ayin Hu Yevorach, which literally means one who has a good eye towards others, Yevorach will be blessed. That's actually what the pasuk is. Chazal have a different drasha in a different context, but literally the pasuk is saying will receive a bracha because of his Tov Ayin. Mida keneged mida. I rejoice in the blessings you have. I become a receptacle for Hashem's blessings. Yevorach shall be blessed. Yevorach shall be blessed. The pasuk in Mishlei. Yeah, so this is an important meter to cultivate, to be happy in the joys of others. And Rav Meir Simcha actually said, it's interesting, we'll call that positive empathy. Now negative empathy, well, I don't know, it means I feel the pain that other people are going through. And empathy is a wonderful quality. I feel your pain. That's called nosei bi'ol. I carry your yoke. And that's a high madrega. But the Rav Meir Simcha, the Meshech Chochmah writes, it's easier to feel the pain of another than to feel the joy of another. It's interesting. Both are very high madregas. Both are very good madregas, that when someone is suffering, I should suffer with them. That's a great thing. But Rav Meir Simcha says, it's easier for me to bear your suffering than it is to feel the joy in your joy. Because at that point, it gets tinged with jealousy and competition. So we might call the positive empathy is a higher madrega than the negative empathy, if that's the right phrase. Yeah.
I always have a question about people, God forbid, somebody's sick, has cancer. They don't want to say it, they don't want to say it.
Yeah.
And my question has always been, tell it to the people, because there are going to be a lot of people saying, tell them.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know, I never understood that part.
Yeah, it is a very good question, and the problem is you're balancing two different ideas. There is an idea that, the Torah says when a person is a mitzorah, as he's walking through the streets, he should say that he's tamei. He should announce that he's tamei. And the simple meaning is so people should avoid him. But Rashi brings a Gemara that says no. He should announce that he's tamei so people should realize his condition so that they should pray for him to be healed. And the Gemara has examples of this, where if a person is going through a tzara, he should be mefarsem, he should publicize the tzara in order that he should have the merit of people praying for him, which of course the merit of many people davening for you is a big zechus in giving you the mercy, rachamim from heaven. So those Gemaras specifically indicate that it is proper to publicize your tzara in order that people should pray and daven. That's very, very true. Now, there is an opposite idea, and the question is how do you balance it, that says that one should not open one's mouth to the Satan, meaning to say that when you say that something bad is happening, then somehow there's a power in the words themselves to make it happen. Don't open up your mouth to the Satan. A person shouldn't say, God forbid, if I ever had A, B, or C, a person shouldn't say anything negative that could befall him or another person, because that is called opening your mouth to the Satan. So, particularly in the beginning stage of an illness, let's say where a diagnosis has not been confirmed or it may turn out to be benign, there might be an inyan in not saying that you may have yener machla, as they say, because that might be opening your mouth to the Satan. Now, on the other hand, you have the other idea, right? So one idea says, tell people so they'll pray. The other is, don't publicize it because you're opening your mouth to the Satan. So it's a balance. I would say that the reticence might be more justifiable in the early stages. But once it's a done deal, unfortunately, then fakir, then you need rachamim. Now, there was another idea, and that is the following. Sometimes, especially when you have a great gadol, so people want to make special gatherings for the great gadol. So there were gedolim that were against special gatherings for themselves, because they basically said, although they were gedolim, right, they were famous and gedolim, they basically said, in their modesty, why should they be singled out from everybody else? And maybe it's arrogance to say that they're worthy of big prayer meetings of thousands of people. What about, this person's father-in-law and this person's mother? They're not getting this gathering. So in their anava, they did not want to be singled out. They thought it would be gaiva. And often they relented only if you included other cholim too. And of course, keep in mind, even in a Misha Berach for only one chola, we always say, Bisoch shar choles. That's very, very important, that we never pray for just one chola, even if we just mention one name. It's always a prayer for all of the cholim. I know Rav Kook, years ago in the 1930s, Rav Kook did not want a kinus tefillah for him because he said, why just for me? Eventually he relented, but that's also an attitude, a certain humility for that. So there are two ideas, not opening up to the Satan and not singling yourself out. Also, it's not just anava, there's also a cheshbon like this. When a person is singled out in a special way, so there is a tzad that the midas hadin is stronger because Hashem is kind of saying, oh, he's so special, let's look in his ma'asim, so there actually is a chashash to make a special kinus for an individual could sometimes be ma'orah midas hadin. So the spiritual formulas here are complex. On one hand, to have 10,000 people daven for him is a great rachamim. On the other hand, to be singled out creates din. So the cheshbon is always going to be, is the rachamim that you get greater than the extra din that you get, right, or not? Hard to figure out. So those are part of the calculations for those things. Same thing with Shinoi Hashem. There is an aspect, I don't know if I'm sure you've heard it over the years, that one of the things we do when a person is very, very ill is we change his name. Why is that so? Because the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, the Rambam brings it, that changing a name can sometimes annul an evil decree, because Hashem's decrees are very exact. Hashem decreed that Reuven dies. I'm not Reuven anymore, I'm somebody else. Now, That's not fooling. Again, I mean, obviously God is not fooled. You can't fool God by changing your name. But it means Hashem looks for rachamim. Hashem looks for ways out, so to speak. So when Hashem can give you rachamim by being literal, he might give you rachamim. But in other words, you're giving Hashem a basis for midas harachamim. Now, sometimes the name usually is something like adding a name. Chaim is a common add, right? Chaim is life. Refael, healing. Baruch or bracha, right? Things like that. Sometimes it's adding a positive name. Sometimes it doesn't have to be. It could be any name. You could just add a Yisrael or whatever it would be. By the way, if the person dies of that sickness and didn't recover, so the added name drops off. It doesn't go on his matzeva, etc. Say again.
If they live, it stays on.
Yeah, if they live, then it stays on. It becomes their permanent identity.
How long does that have to live?
Yeah. In other words, he doesn't die of that sickness. That's what I mean. In other words, if he dies in an automobile accident, that's a separate thing. But if he was cured from the sickness, the name stays. Now, so there's a whole ceremony. Shinui Hashem is a big ceremony. There's a lot of Tehillim that you say, and there's a paragraph. Again, you don't have. I mean, it's not required. But the Shinui Hashem has very long tefillas. Rav Yaakov Emden Siddur has the whole nusach of Shinui Hashem. But I do know that even among the Gedolim that were very, very against Shinui Hashem, because they felt that Shinui Hashem is an acknowledgement that the situation, Shinui Hashem is changing the name. Shinui Hashem is an acknowledgement that this is a critical situation in which death is imminent, and they felt that was opening up their mouth to the Satan, that the Shinui Hashem itself might make the situation worse. So these are difficult things to cheshbonos. In other words, different people will go different ways. There were people who were very reluctant to go with Shinui Hashem because, they say like this. If it was really very close to death, they feel it's improper because you're asking Hashem for miracles and you don't ask Hashem for miracles. And if it's not so close, then you're making it worse. So they couldn't find the right place where you do Shinui Hashem. It's either too close to death or too far from death. So they didn't want to do it. I know my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman, was reluctant to be Mishana Hashem. He normally did not do it. In fact, for himself, he didn't do it. And the like. Okay, so that's kind of the cheshbon about publicizing.